The rusted chain squeaked with every rotation as I pedaled through downtown Millfield. 20-year-old paint chips flaked off the frame, leaving a trail of faded blue behind me on the sidewalk. The handlebars wobbled despite my attempts to tighten them, and the left pedal had developed an annoying grinding sound that echoed off the storefronts I passed. But this bicycle was all I had. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Sarah Martinez had never imagined her life would come to this. 6 months ago, she'd been living in a decent apartment, working at Henderson Marketing Solutions and saving up for a car. Now she found herself pushing through the glass doors of Crawford Industries, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her cheeks still flushed from the embarrassing ride through the business district. The security guard at the front desk looked up from his newspaper, his eyes immediately drawn to the ancient Schwinn she'd chained to the bike rack outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the bicycle looked even more pathetic next to the gleaming BMWs, Audis, and Mercedes in the employee parking lot. "First day?" the guard asked, though his tone suggested he'd already formed an opinion about the type of employee who arrived on such transportation. "Yes, sir. Sarah Martinez, starting in the accounting department." He handed her a temporary badge and gestured toward the elevators. 15th floor. Ask for Mrs. Patterson." The elevator ride felt eternal. Sarah caught her reflection in the car, polished steel doors, and tried to smooth down her hair, which the helmet had flattened on top and left wild on the sides. Her professional blazer, bought secondhand from a thrift store, was wrinkled from being stuffed in her bag during the ride. She'd done her best to look presentable on a budget that barely covered rent and groceries. The elevator dinged, and she stepped into a world that felt completely foreign. The accounting department at Crawford Industries occupied the entire 15th floor, with its open concept design, ergonomic chairs, and massive windows overlooking the city. Employees moved between cubicles with an air of purpose and prosperity that Sarah envied. "You must be Sarah." A woman with perfectly styled gray hair approached her. "I'm Eleanor Patterson, department supervisor. Ready for orientation?" Mrs. Patterson led her through the maze of workstations, pointing out the break room, supply closet, and various departmental areas. Sarah noticed how conversations seemed to pause as they walked by, followed by whispered exchanges and sideways glances. She wondered if her appearance was that obviously different from everyone else's. Her workstation was in the far corner, a small cubicle with a dated computer and a stack of files that reached nearly to her elbow. As Mrs. Patterson explained the filing system and introduced her to the accounting software, Sarah tried to focus, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. "Lunch is from 12 to 1, Mrs. Patterson concluded. "The cafeteria is on the 3rd floor, but most people drive somewhere nearby. I'm sure you'll figure something out." The comment stung more than it should have. Sarah spent the morning diving into her work, reviewing expense reports and entering data. The tasks weren't particularly challenging, but the software was unfamiliar, and she found herself working slower than she'd hoped. At 11:30, she overheard 2 women talking at the neighboring cubicles. "Did you see how she got here this morning?" one whispered. "The bicycle? I thought it was some kind of joke at first. Who rides a bike to work in the business district? And did you see the condition of it? I've seen better bikes at garage sales." Sarah's cheeks burned. She kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen, pretending to be absorbed in a particularly complex expense report while the conversation continued. "I heard she's living in one of those cheap apartments on the south side," the first woman continued. "You know, the ones they're always threatening to tear down. Well, at least she has a job now, though I can't imagine what Mrs. Patterson was thinking when she hired her." The words felt like physical blows. Sarah had worked so hard to get this position, spending weeks preparing for the interview, researching the company, and practicing her responses to potential questions. She'd thought her qualifications and enthusiasm would be enough to overcome any initial impressions. Lunch hour arrived like a mercy. While her co-workers gathered their purses and car keys, discussing which restaurant to try, Sarah retrieved her brown bag lunch from the small refrigerator in the break room. She'd packed a simple sandwich and an apple, the same lunch she'd eaten for the past 3 months to save money. Rather than endure the cafeteria where she'd inevitably sit alone, Sarah decided to eat outside. She took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out to the small courtyard beside the building. A few concrete benches surrounded a modest fountain, and she chose one that offered a view of the parking lot. As she unwrapped her sandwich, she watched the stream of employees returning from their lunch outings. They emerged from expensive cars, laughing and chatting, carrying takeout bags from restaurants she couldn't afford to visit. The contrast between their lives and hers felt overwhelming. Rough day? Sarah looked up to find a man in his 50s approaching her bench. He wore a well-tailored suit and carried himself with the kind of confidence that usually intimidated her. She recognized him vaguely from the morning elevator ride, but hadn't caught his name. "Oh no, just enjoying the fresh air," she replied, quickly wrapping up the remainder of her sandwich. "Mind if I sit? I'm Robert Chen, Facilities Management." He gestured to the bench, and when she nodded, he settled beside her with a slight grunt. "I couldn't help but notice your bicycle this morning. That's a classic Schwinn, isn't it?" Sarah's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. Another person is ready to comment on her pathetic transportation situation. "Yes, it belonged to my grandmother," she said quietly. "It's not much to look at anymore." "Are you kidding? Those old Schwinns were built to last. My father had one just like it when I was growing up. He rode that thing for 30 years before it finally gave out." Robert smiled warmly. "Take me back, seeing one still on the road." The unexpected kindness in his voice caught Sarah off guard. She'd braced herself for mockery or pity, not genuine appreciation. "Most people think it's pretty ridiculous," she admitted. "Most people don't know quality when they see it," Robert replied. "Besides, you're getting exercise, saving money on gas, and helping the environment. Sounds pretty smart to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fountain cycle through its modest water display. Sarah found herself relaxing, for the first time all day. "I take it that the transition to Crawford Industries has been challenging?" Robert asked gently. "Is it that obvious?" "New job anxiety is pretty universal. Plus, this place can feel intimidating when you're starting out. Big corporations, lots of unwritten rules, established social groups." He paused. "But you wouldn't be here if you weren't qualified. Mrs. Patterson doesn't hire people lightly." Sarah appreciated his attempt at encouragement, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I just need to prove myself, I suppose." "You will. Give it time." Robert stood up and straightened his jacket. "And Sarah, don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that bicycle. Some of the most remarkable people I've known have had humble beginnings." As he walked back toward the building, Sarah wondered what he meant by that comment. There had been something in his tone, a weight to his words that suggested personal experience. She finished her apple and gathered her things, feeling slightly more optimistic about the afternoon ahead. The rest of the day passed more smoothly. She made significant progress on her assigned files and even managed to help a coworker locate a missing invoice. By 5 o'clock, she felt like she'd actually contributed something meaningful to the department. The evening ride home took her through different neighborhoods, each one telling its own story. She passed the upscale area where her coworkers probably lived, with their manicured lawns and 3-car garages. Then came the middle-class section with modest houses and small front yards where children played on swing sets. Finally, she reached her own neighborhood, where apartment buildings stretched along busy streets and convenience stores stayed open late to serve the night shift workers. Her building was a 4-story brick structure that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling around the windows, and the front steps had cracks that caught rainwater and never seemed to dry completely. But her 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor was clean, quiet, and affordable. which was all she could ask. For right now. Sarah carried her bicycle up the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment. The building didn't have secure bike storage, and she'd learned the hard way that leaving anything valuable outside was asking for trouble. Inside her small living room, the bicycle looked enormous and out of place, but it was safer there than anywhere else. She heated up leftover pasta for dinner and settled onto her second-hand couch with a library book. The day had been exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Starting over at 28 years old wasn't supposed to feel this difficult. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Jessica in Portland. How was the first day at the new job? Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Better than expected. Still adjusting. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She had made it through the day, completed her assignments, and even had one positive interaction. Maybe that was enough for now. Outside her window, the city lights were beginning to twinkle as darkness settled over Millfield. Somewhere out there, her co-workers were probably enjoying dinner at nice restaurants or relaxing in comfortable homes. But Sarah had something they didn't realize they were missing. The quiet satisfaction of knowing she was building something from nothing, one difficult day at a time. Tomorrow, she would ride that ridiculous bicycle back to Crawford Industries, and she would continue proving that appearances could be deceiving. 3 weeks into her tenure at Crawford Industries, Sarah had developed a routine that minimized her interactions with the judgmental coworkers. She arrived 15 minutes early to avoid the morning elevator crowd, ate lunch in the courtyard whenever weather permitted, and stayed late to finish her work when the office was quieter. Her productivity had impressed Mrs. Patterson, who'd assigned her increasingly complex projects. Sarah found herself handling quarterly reconciliations that typically went to employees with years of experience. The work challenged her in ways her previous job never had, and despite the social isolation, she felt intellectually engaged for the first time in months. On a Thursday morning in October, everything changed. Sarah was deep in concentration, tracing a discrepancy through months of invoices, when commotion erupted near the main elevator bank. Voices carried across the open office space, though she couldn't make out specific words. She glanced up to see a cluster of employees gathering near the reception area, their usual workplace chatter replaced by excited whispers. "What's happening?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the woman from the neighboring cubicle who'd made the garage sale comment on Sarah's first day. "Some kind of military delegation," replied another co-worker. "3 officers just got off the elevator. Looks important." Sarah's curiosity was minimal. Military contractors visited Crawford Industries occasionally for budget reviews, though she'd never witnessed such a formal arrival. She returned to her spreadsheet, determined to solve the invoice mystery before lunch. The whispers grew louder. Through her peripheral vision, she could see the crowd expanding as more employees abandoned their desks to catch a glimpse of whatever was unfolding. The excitement was infectious, but Sarah had learned to keep her head down and focus on her responsibilities. "They're asking about someone," Jennifer hissed to her cubicle mate. "I heard them mention a name, but I couldn't catch it." "Probably here for the Henderson contract review," came the response. "You know how those Defense Department people are about their protocols." Sarah's concentration was finally broken when she realized the office had gone completely silent. Not the typical lull that occasionally settled over the workspace, but an absolute quiet that felt charged with tension. She looked up from her computer to find every single person in the accounting department staring in her direction. Her first instinct was to check if something was wrong with her appearance. Had she spilled coffee on her blouse? Was there something stuck in her hair? But as she followed their gazes, she realized they weren't looking at her specifically. They were looking past her, toward the elevator bank. Sarah turned in her chair and felt her breath catch. 3 military officers stood near the reception desk, their dress uniforms immaculate and their bearing unmistakably authoritative. The man in the center wore the insignia of a full colonel, flanked by two captains whose crisp salutes and rigid postures spoke of years of disciplined service. Mrs. Patterson approached the group with visible nervousness, her usual composed demeanor, replaced by the flustered energy of someone trying to manage an unexpected situation. Sarah could see her gesturing and speaking, though the distance made it impossible to hear the conversation. The colonel nodded once, said something brief to Mrs. Patterson, and then began walking directly toward Sarah's corner of the office. Every step echoed in the silent workspace. Employees shifted in their chairs to maintain visual contact with the approaching delegation, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and anticipation that Sarah felt mirrored in her own chest. As the officers drew closer, details became sharper. The colonel was perhaps 50 years old, with gray temples and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen more of the world than most people could imagine. His uniform bore ribbons and medals that spoke of significant service, though Sarah couldn't identify their specific meanings. 20 feet away. 15. 10. The colonel stopped directly in front of Sarah's cubicle. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Had she made some catastrophic error in her work? Was there a security issue with her background check that had somehow triggered a military investigation? She'd been meticulous about her responsibilities, but perhaps she'd missed something crucial in one of the defense-related accounts she'd been handling. Ms. Martinez? The colonel's voice was firm but not unkind. Yes, sir. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She started to stand, but the colonel gestured for her to remain, seated. I'm Colonel Williams, United States Army. These are Captain Rodriguez and Captain Thompson. He paused, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. We need to speak with you privately. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, the entire accounting department had abandoned any pretense of working. Even Mrs. Patterson stood frozen near her office door, clearly as bewildered as everyone else by this unprecedented interruption. Have I done something wrong? Sarah asked. On the contrary, Colonel Williams replied. But this conversation requires privacy. Is there somewhere we can talk? Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, having apparently found her voice. We can use conference. Room B. It's just down the hall. The colonel nodded his acknowledgement, but kept his attention fixed on Sarah. If you would, Ms. Martinez. Standing on unsteady legs, Sarah gathered her composure and followed the military delegation toward the conference room. Behind her, she could feel the weight of dozens of stairs and knew that speculation would run rampant the moment she was out of earshot. Conference Room B was a sterile space with a long mahogany table, leather chairs, and motivational posters, featuring corporate buzzwords like synergy and excellence. Colonel Williams closed the door firmly and gestured for Sarah to take a seat across from him. The two captains flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Sarah felt like she was facing a tribunal rather than a business meeting. Ms. Martinez, Colonel Williams began, we've been trying to locate you for quite some time. I don't understand. I've been living at the same address for 6 months, working here for 3 weeks. I'm not exactly hiding. You've been using your mother's maiden name. The statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't used her father's surname since she was 18, choosing instead to honor her mother's Mexican heritage after her father had abandoned them both. But somehow, these military officers had connected her current identity to her past. I legally changed my name when I turned 18, she said carefully. There's nothing deceptive about it. We're not here about deception, Ms. Martinez. We're here about honor. Colonel Williams reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder, placing it carefully on the conference table between them. Sarah could see her name written on the tab, but in a font and format that suggested official government documentation. What you don't know, the colonel continued, is that your father spent considerable time trying to reconnect with you before his death 2 years ago. He left specific instructions regarding certain recognitions that had been delayed by classified operations. Sarah's world tilted. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had walked out when she was 8 years old, leaving behind nothing but child support payments that arrived sporadically and eventually stopped altogether. Her mother had raised her alone, working double shifts at the hospital to keep them afloat. The idea that he'd tried to reach her in his final years seemed impossible. "I don't want anything from him," she said firmly. "He made his choice when he left." "Major Bennett made many choices," Colonel Williams replied, and something in his tone made Sarah look up sharply. "Some of them saved the lives of his entire unit in Afghanistan." The word major hung in the air between them. Sarah had always assumed her father was just another deadbeat dad who'd run away from responsibility. The possibility that he'd been serving overseas, that his absence might have had meaning beyond simple abandonment, had never occurred to her. Captain Rodriguez opened the folder and withdrew a photograph. It showed a man in desert camouflage, surrounded by soldiers in what appeared to be a forward operating base. The face was older and more weathered than Sarah remembered, but unmistakably her father. Major Thomas Bennett served 3 tours in Afghanistan as an intelligence officer, Colonel Williams explained. His work was classified at the highest levels, which meant he couldn't maintain contact with family members for security reasons. The Army strongly discouraged personal communications that might compromise operational security. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this image with her childhood memories of a man who'd simply vanished. That doesn't excuse abandoning his family. "You're absolutely right," the colonel agreed. "But it might explain why he spent his final years trying to make amends and why he left instructions for us to find you." Captain Thompson withdrew another document from the folder. Major Bennett was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for actions that saved 43 American lives during an insurgent attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. The citation was classified until last month. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Her father, the man she'd spent 20 years resenting, had been a decorated war hero. The abandonment that had shaped her entire childhood had been connected to service and sacrifice she'd never imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask. Colonel Williams leaned forward slightly. "Because, Ms. Martinez, your father's final wish was that you receive recognition for the sacrifices you made as well. Military families serve too, even when they don't realize it." The documents scattered across the conference table felt surreal. Sarah stared at commendation letters, classified mission reports, and photographs of her father receiving medals she'd never known existed. Each page revealed a man completely different from the absent figure who'd haunted her childhood memories. "This particular operation," Captain Rodriguez explained, pointing to a heavily redacted report, involved extracting intelligence that prevented a coordinated attack on 3 NATO installations. Your father spent 18 months building the network that made this intelligence possible. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up a letter written in her father's handwriting. The paper was worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then the Army has finally cleared the classification barriers that kept me from reaching out while I was alive. I know my absence cost you and your mother everything, and I know sorry isn't enough to repair 20 years of damage. But I need you to understand that every day overseas, I carried your school photo in my vest pocket. Every mission, every dangerous assignment, I thought about coming home to explain why I had to leave." The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing classified operations that had kept him deployed for extended periods, dangerous assignments that prohibited family contact, and his desperate attempts to balance duty with fatherhood. He'd sent money when possible, though Sarah's mother had never mentioned receiving anything beyond the court-ordered child support. "Your father established a trust fund," Colonel Williams said gently. "The proceeds from his military benefits, combat pay, and savings. It's been accumulating interest for 2 years, waiting for us to locate you." Sarah looked up from the letter, Her eyes blurred with tears she'd been fighting since the conversation began. How much? $67,000. The number hit her like a physical force. $67,000 would change everything. She could afford a car, a better apartment, maybe even start the nursing program she'd been dreaming about since college. The bicycle rides through mockery and shame could end tomorrow. But somehow, the money felt less significant than the letter in her hands. There's something else, Captain Thompson added. Major Bennett requested that if we found you, we would arrange for you to receive his service decorations in a formal ceremony. He wanted you to understand what his sacrifice meant, not just to the army, but to the country. A ceremony? This Friday evening, at the regional military headquarters. It would be attended by senior officers, local officials, and representatives from the units your father served overseas. Colonel Williams paused. The ceremony would be open to your colleagues and friends, if you'd like them to attend. Sarah's mind immediately went to her co-workers, still frozen at their desks outside this conference room, probably speculating about why the military had come looking for the woman with the embarrassing bicycle. The irony was almost overwhelming. I need time to think about this, she said. Of course, here's my direct number. Colonel Williams handed her a business card. Call me by tomorrow evening with your decision. After the officers left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room for nearly 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When she finally returned to her cubicle, the entire accounting department erupted into barely contained curiosity. What was that about? Jennifer Walsh asked, her previous dismissive attitude replaced by obvious intrigue. Family matter, Sarah replied simply, settling back into her chair. Military family matters, corrected another co-worker. Those weren't just any officers. That colonel had some serious decorations. Sarah focused on her computer screen, but concentration was impossible. Around her, speculation ran wild. She caught fragments of conversations throughout the afternoon, theories about secret government contracts, speculation about her background, and wild guesses about why the military would seek out a junior accounting clerk. By closing time, Sarah had made her decision. That evening, she called Colonel Williams from her apartment kitchen while heating up leftover soup. I'd like to accept the ceremony, she said, and I'd like my co-workers to be invited. Excellent. I'll have Captain Rodriguez deliver formal invitations to your supervisor tomorrow. The ceremony begins at 6 p.m. sharp. Friday afternoon brought a transformation to the accounting department that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Patterson had announced the invitations during the morning staff meeting, explaining that Sarah was being honored for her family's military service and that attendance was encouraged but optional. The same people who'd whispered about her bicycle were now approaching her desk with awkward attempts at conversation. I had no idea you came from a military family, said Jennifer Walsh, perching on the edge of Sarah's desk. My brother served in Iraq. It's such a sacrifice for families. Others shared similar stories. Grandfathers who'd fought in Vietnam, cousins deployed to various overseas locations, neighbors who'd returned from combat deployments. Sarah realized that many of her co-workers had military connections they'd never mentioned, and her father's service provided an unexpected bridge to common ground. But she also noticed the calculating looks, the way conversations shifted when she approached, the subtle change in how people addressed her. They weren't necessarily warmer, just more careful, as if they were reassessing her value based on new information. At 5 o'clock, Sarah faced a dilemma she hadn't considered. The ceremony required professional attire, but her limited wardrobe consisted mostly of thrift store finds and hand-me-downs. She'd planned to wear her best blazer, the same one she'd worn to the job interview, but seeing her co-workers prepare for the evening made her realize how inadequate it would look. Sarah? Mrs. Patterson appeared at her cubicle. Could I speak with you privately? They walked to Mrs. Patterson's office, where she closed the door and turned to face Sarah with an expression of maternal concern. I hope this isn't presumptuous, Mrs. Patterson began, but I have a daughter about your size who works in corporate law. She has some professional suits that she's outgrown, and I thought perhaps you might be interested in borrowing something for tonight." The offer was clearly motivated by kindness, but it also highlighted how obvious Sarah's financial situation had become to everyone around her. Pride warred with practicality as she considered the suggestion. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Patterson, but I'll be fine with what I have." "Of course, dear. But the offer stands if you change your mind. Tonight is about honoring your father's service, and you should feel confident and comfortable." Sarah left the office feeling more conflicted than grateful. The kindness was genuine, but it also underscored the gap between her circumstances and those of her colleagues. She decided to go home, shower, and make the best of her limited options. Her apartment felt smaller than usual as she laid out her clothes for the evening. The black blazer was serviceable, but showed its age in the slightly faded fabric and loose buttons. Her dress pants were clean, but clearly inexpensive. She'd polished her shoes until they gleamed, but nothing could disguise the fact that they'd been resoled twice. As she dressed, Sarah thought about her father's letter and the phrase that had stuck with her. "Every mission, every dangerous assignment. I thought about coming home to explain why I had to leave. He'd never gotten that chance. But tonight, in some strange way, his explanation was finally reaching her." The regional military headquarters occupied a sprawling complex on the north side of Millfield, surrounded by perfectly maintained grounds and imposing architecture that spoke of government authority and national purpose. Sarah arrived by taxi, having splurged on the expense rather than risk arriving sweaty and disheveled from another bicycle ride. The main entrance was bustling with activity. Officers in dress uniforms moved through the lobby with practiced efficiency, while civilian guests checked in at a formal reception desk staffed by military personnel. Sarah approached the desk with her invitation, feeling underdressed despite her best efforts. The staff sergeant checking names wore a uniform that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Ms. Martinez? Welcome. The ceremony is in Assembly Hall C, just down this corridor. Your guests have already arrived." Her guests. Sarah had assumed her co-workers might attend out of curiosity, but she hadn't expected them to arrive early or seek her out. As she walked toward the assembly hall, she wondered what kind of reception awaited her. The hallway was lined with portraits of military leaders and displays showcasing the base's history. Sarah paused at a memorial wall dedicated to soldiers killed in action, reading names of men and women who'd given their lives in service to their country. Her father's name wasn't there, but seeing the endless list of sacrifices gave her a new perspective on his choices. Assembly Hall C was larger than she'd expected, with seating for perhaps 200 people arranged in formal rows facing a raised platform. Military flags flanked the stage, and a podium bearing the Army insignia commanded attention at the center. Sarah scanned the gathering crowd and spotted her Crawford Industries colleagues occupying a section near the middle of the hall. "Mrs. Patterson waved her over, and as Sarah approached, she was surprised to see that nearly the entire accounting department had attended. "This is incredible," Jennifer Walsh said as Sarah settled into the chair they'd saved for her. "I've never been to a military ceremony before." Around them, the hall continued to fill with uniformed personnel and civilian guests. Sarah noticed other families receiving similar honors, their stories likely as complex and unexpected as her own. The diversity of attendees suggested that military service touched far more lives than most people realized. At exactly 6 o'clock, a sergeant called the assembly to attention. The entire hall rose as senior officers filed onto the stage, their presence commanding immediate respect and silence. A general Sarah didn't recognize approached the podium, his uniform decorated with ribbons and medals that indicated decades of distinguished service. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's recognition ceremony. Tonight, we honor not only the service members who gave their lives in defense of our nation, but also the families who shared in their sacrifice." Sarah's pulse quickened as the general continued, outlining the evening's agenda and the significance of posthumous recognitions. This wasn't just about her father. It was about acknowledging the hidden costs of military service that extended far beyond the battlefield. Our first recognition tonight honors Major Thomas Bennett, who was killed in action while conducting classified intelligence operations in Afghanistan. Major Bennett's work directly contributed to the safety of coalition forces and the success of multiple counterterrorism operations. Hearing her father's full rank and the circumstances of his death delivered with such formal gravity made everything suddenly real. He hadn't just been absent. He'd been dead for 2 years while she'd continued harboring resentment for his abandonment. Major Bennett left behind a daughter, Ms. Sarah Martinez, who served alongside him through the sacrifices required of military families. Tonight, we recognize her contribution to his service and honor the legacy of dedication that defines the Bennett family. The general gestured toward Sarah, and she realized with shock that she was expected to approach the stage. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she rose from her chair. The entire assembly hall had turned to watch her walk toward the stage, hundreds of eyes tracking her movement through the formal military setting. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Patterson whispering encouragement, but the words seemed distant and muffled. The walk to the platform felt endless. Each step echoed in the hushed hall, and Sarah became acutely aware of her second-hand blazer and rizzled shoes in this environment of crisp uniforms and formal protocol. But as she climbed the steps to the stage, something shifted in her perception. This wasn't about her appearance or her financial circumstances. This was about her father's legacy and the recognition that his sacrifice deserved. General Morrison, whose nameplate she could now see clearly, stood waiting with a leather presentation case in his hands. Beside him, Colonel Williams offered an encouraging nod that helped steady her nerves. "Ms. Martinez," the general began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system, "your father's service to this nation extended far beyond his official tours of duty. Major Bennett volunteered for the most dangerous intelligence assignments, often spending months in hostile territory to gather information that saved countless American lives." The general opened the presentation case, revealing medals Sarah had only seen in war movies: the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor device, and others whose significance she could only guess at. These decorations represent specific acts of heroism and sustained exceptional service under combat conditions. But Major Bennett understood that military service requires sacrifice from entire families, not just those who wear the uniform. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes as the general continued. In his final letter to the Department of the Army, Major Bennett wrote, "My daughter Sarah has served this country every day that I was overseas. She sacrificed her childhood stability, her family's financial security, and her right to have a father present during the most important years of her development. She served without recognition, without support, and without understanding why that service was necessary. If this nation truly values military families, then we must honor their contributions as we honor those who carry weapons in foreign lands." The words hit Sarah like a revelation. Her father had seen her struggles, had understood the cost of his absence, and had fought to ensure her sacrifices weren't forgotten. The resentment she'd carried for 20 years began to transform into something more complex: grief for lost time, pride in unexpected purpose, and a connection to service she'd never recognized. Major Bennett requested that these decorations be presented to his daughter, not as inherited honors, but as recognition for her own service to this nation. "Ms. Martinez, it is my privilege to present you with your father's Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." The general lifted the medal from its case and stepped forward. Sarah bowed her head slightly as he placed the ribbon around her neck, the weight of the decoration feeling both foreign and meaningful against her chest. The Purple Heart, awarded to Major Bennett for wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States, and now entrusted to your care as a reminder that the wounds of military service extend to families as well. Another medal joined the first. Sarah could hear movement in the audience but didn't dare look up to see how her co-workers were reacting to this transformation. The Bronze Star Medal with Valor device, recognizing Major Bennett's heroic achievement during ground combat operations, and acknowledging that heroism sometimes means sacrificing personal happiness for a greater cause. As each decoration was presented, the general explained not only Major Bennett's specific actions, but also the broader context of military family service. Sarah began to understand that her childhood struggles hadn't been meaningless hardships, but part of a larger tradition of sacrifice that stretched back generations. Finally, General Morrison continued, I present you with this flag, flown over Forward Operating Base Chapman during your father's final mission. Major Bennett carried a photograph of you during every patrol, every dangerous assignment, every moment when his life was at risk. You were his motivation to continue serving, even when that service kept him from being the father he wanted to be. The folded American flag was placed in Sarah's hands with ceremonial precision. The fabric felt heavier than she'd expected, dense with meaning and memory. Ms. Martinez, on behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for sharing your father's dedication to protecting the freedoms we all cherish. The general stepped back and rendered a crisp salute. Sarah, uncertain of protocol, returned the gesture as best she could. Behind her, the entire assembly rose to their feet in sustained applause that seemed to go on forever. As the applause continued, Sarah finally allowed herself to look out at the audience. Her co-workers from Crawford Industries were on their feet with everyone else, but their expressions had changed completely from the curious detachment she'd expected. Mrs. Patterson was wiping tears from her eyes. Jennifer Walsh looked stunned, as if seeing Sarah for the first time. Even the facilities manager Robert Chen, whom she spotted near the back, was applauding with obvious emotion. But it was the military personnel in the audience whose reaction affected her most. These men and women, who'd chosen careers of service and understood its costs, were acknowledging her as one of their own. She saw recognition in their faces, respect for sacrifices she'd never realized she'd made. Colonel Williams approached, the microphone for the formal conclusion of her ceremony. The presentation of Major Bennett's decorations concludes this recognition, but Ms. Martinez, there's one more element your father requested. Sarah turned, confused. The general had indicated that all the medals had been presented. Major Bennett left specific instructions that if we located you, we should extend an offer. The Army maintains several programs for family members of fallen service personnel. With your educational background and your father's service record, you would qualify for officer candidate school should you choose to pursue military service yourself. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had never considered military service, had spent her adult life trying to distance herself from anything connected to her father's absence. But standing on this stage, wearing his decorations, she felt something she'd never experienced before, a connection to a purpose larger than herself. I would need time to consider such a decision, she replied. Of course, the offer remains open indefinitely. As the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by people wanting to offer congratulations and share their own military connections. Her co-workers approached with a mixture of awe and awkwardness, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed with the person they'd just watched being honored on a military stage. Sarah, I had no idea, Jennifer Walsh said, reaching out to touch one of the medals. This is incredible. Your father was a genuine war hero. We all owe you an apology, added another co-worker. We made assumptions about your situation without understanding what you'd been through. Mrs. Patterson waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. My dear, this changes everything, doesn't it? About how you see your past, your father, yourself? Sarah nodded, still processing the evening's revelations. I think I need some time to figure out what it all means. Take all the time you need. And Sarah? I hope you know that your position at Crawford Industries is secure for as long as you want it. The though something tells me you might have bigger decisions to make now." As the assembly hall emptied, Sarah remained on the stage, looking out at the rows of chairs where moments earlier, hundreds of people had witnessed her transformation from overlooked employee to honored family member of a military hero. Colonel Williams approached with the presentation case containing her father's medals. "These belong to you now, Ms. Martinez, along with his personal effects, which we can arrange to deliver next week." "Colonel, can I ask you something? Why did my father never try to contact me directly? Even if his work was classified, couldn't he have found a way to let me know he was alive?" The honest answer is complicated. Your father's intelligence work required him to maintain complete operational security. Any contact with family members created potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemy forces. But I also think he was ashamed. Ashamed? Major Bennett knew his absence was destroying his family. He knew your mother was struggling financially and emotionally. He carried tremendous guilt about choosing duty over fatherhood, even when that duty was saving lives. I think he convinced himself that staying away completely was less harmful than appearing sporadically and creating false hope. Sarah considered this explanation as she carefully placed the medals back in their case. Her father's choices suddenly seemed less like abandonment and more like a tragic miscalculation born from impossible circumstances. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build with this new understanding of your past. Your father's trust fund gives you financial freedom you've never had. His decorations give you access to military communities and support networks. Most importantly, his story gives you a different narrative about your childhood and your family's place in something larger than yourselves." Sarah descended from the stage carrying the medal case and the folded flag, feeling the weight of legacy and possibility. Outside the assembly hall, her co-workers were gathered in small groups, their conversations animated by the evening's unexpected revelations. As she emerged from the building into the cool October night, Sarah realized that Monday morning would bring a completely different dynamic to the Crawford Industries accounting department. She was no longer the struggling employee with the embarrassing bicycle. She was the daughter of a decorated war hero, a person whose sacrifices had been formally recognized by the United States military. But more than that, she was someone who finally understood that her struggles had meaning, that her resilience was part of a tradition of service, and that the modest life she'd been building wasn't a failure, but a continuation of the strength that had defined her family for generations. Monday morning arrived with an autumn crispness that made Sarah's bicycle ride to Crawford Industries feel different from every previous journey. The same squeaky chain and wobbling handlebars carried her through the business district, but the whispers and stares from pedestrians had taken on a new quality. Word of Friday's ceremony had somehow spread beyond her workplace, and she caught fragments of conversations as she passed. "That's her," someone said from a coffee shop doorway. "The one whose father was the war hero." Sarah locked her bicycle to the same rack she'd used for weeks, but this time several co-workers were waiting near the building entrance, apparently hoping to catch her arrival. The attention felt surreal after months of being virtually invisible. "Sarah!" Jennifer Walsh called out, practically bouncing with excitement. "We've been talking all weekend about Friday night. It was incredible." "The whole department's been buzzing," added Marcus Chen from payroll. "Mrs. Patterson said you might be considering some major life changes?" Sarah had spent the weekend thinking about exactly that question. The trust fund Colonel Williams had mentioned would arrive within days, giving her financial security she'd never imagined. The military's offer of officer candidate school represented a complete career change that would honor her father's legacy. But more immediately, she had to decide whether to stay at Crawford Industries or pursue something that better reflected her new understanding of herself. Inside the building, the transformation was even more noticeable. The security guard who'd barely acknowledged her existence now stood as she approached. "Good morning, Ms. Martinez. Heard about the ceremony Friday. Your father sounds like he was quite a man." "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. He was complicated, but yes, He was remarkable. The elevator ride to the 15th floor filled quickly with coworkers who suddenly seemed eager to share the same space. Conversations flowed around her about military service, family sacrifices, and the honor of Friday's recognition. Sarah found herself answering questions about her father's missions, though much of what she'd learned remained classified. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at her cubicle with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested important conversation ahead. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to discuss some opportunities that have come up since Friday evening." They walked to Mrs. Patterson's office, where she closed the door and gestured for Sarah to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk. "First, I want you to know that several department heads attended Friday's ceremony. Your recognition has opened doors within the company that I don't think you realize exist." Mrs. Patterson opened a folder and withdrew several documents. "The executive team has approved an immediate promotion to senior financial analyst, with a salary increase of $22,000 annually. The position would involve working directly with our government contracts division, where your family's military background would be considered an asset rather than simply a personal detail." Sarah stared at the promotion paperwork. 6 weeks ago, she'd been grateful just to have a job. Now she was being offered a senior position with a salary that would change her entire lifestyle. "There's also this," Mrs. Patterson continued, withdrawing another document. "Crawford Industries has a partnership with the State University's evening MBA program. The company would cover full tuition for employees pursuing advanced degrees in business or finance. With your new position, you'd qualify for immediate enrollment." The offers were generous beyond anything Sarah had expected, but they also felt like responses to her changed social status rather than recognition of her actual work performance. The woman receiving these opportunities was the same person who'd been barely tolerated just days earlier. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate these offers more than I can express. But I need to ask, would these opportunities have been available to me before Friday night?" Mrs. Patterson's pause answered the question before she spoke. "Honestly, probably not. The reality is that corporations make decisions based on multiple factors, and sometimes those factors include how employees reflect on the company's values and image. Your military family background creates positive associations that benefit both you and Crawford Industries." Sarah appreciated the honesty, even though it confirmed her suspicions about corporate motivations. "I'd like to think about these offers," Sarah said. "The ceremony Friday night changed my perspective on a lot of things, and I want to make sure my decisions align with what I've learned about myself and my family." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Back at her cubicle, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on the expense reports that had occupied her attention for weeks. The work that had once challenged her now felt routine, a way station rather than a destination. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Williams. "Trust. Fund paperwork complete. Available for pickup at your convenience." During lunch, Sarah rode her bicycle to the regional military headquarters to collect the financial documents that would officially change her economic circumstances. The same staff sergeant who'd checked her in for the ceremony greeted her with genuine warmth. "Ms. Martinez, good to see you again. Colonel Williams is waiting in his office." The colonel's office was lined with military memorabilia, photographs from various deployments, and commendations that spoke of a career dedicated to service. He stood as Sarah entered, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. "How are you processing everything from Friday?" he asked, still figuring it out, honestly. "It's like learning my entire childhood was based on incomplete information." That's not uncommon for military families. Classification requirements often mean that sacrifices go unrecognized for years, sometimes decades. Colonel Williams handed her a manila envelope thick with documents. "This contains all the trust fund paperwork, including account access information and investment details. Your father was quite careful about ensuring this money would be available when you needed it. Most." Sarah opened the envelope and scanned the financial statements, $67,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined having access to, but seeing it documented in official bank paperwork made it feel overwhelmingly real. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," the colonel continued. "Since Friday night, I've received several calls from military recruiters who attended the ceremony. Word has spread about your background and your potential interest in service. The offers go beyond officer candidate school." "What do you mean?" "The Army's Intelligence Division is specifically interested in recruiting people with your educational background and family military history. They're offering direct commissioning as a first lieutenant, with assignments to analytical positions that would utilize your financial skills. No basic training required, just officer orientation and specialized intelligence training." The offer represented a complete departure from everything Sarah had planned for her life, but it also felt like a natural extension of the legacy she'd inherited from her father. "Why are they so interested in me specifically?" "Intelligence work often requires people who understand sacrifice, who can handle isolation and stress, and who have personal motivations for protecting American interests. Your background suggests you have all those qualities, plus analytical skills that are always in demand." Sarah left the military headquarters with more questions than answers, but also with a sense of possibility she'd never experienced. Her bicycle ride back to Crawford Industries took her through the park, where she'd eaten lunch alone on difficult days, past the apartment buildings where she'd imagined living someday, and through the business district where she'd learned to navigate professional hierarchies. Everything looked the same, but her relationship to it all had fundamentally changed. That evening, Sarah spread the military documents, job offers, and financial paperwork across her small kitchen table. The trust fund meant she could afford a car, a better apartment, or even a completely different life. The corporate promotion offered immediate security and social status. The military commission promised purpose and connection to something larger than herself. But as she studied her options, Sarah realized the most important change wasn't external. For the first time since childhood, she understood her own story. The struggling single mother who'd raised her had been a military spouse dealing with classified deployment. The absent father she'd resented had been a war hero whose sacrifice had saved lives. The financial hardships that had shaped her character had been the cost of serving something greater than personal comfort. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller ID showed her sister Jessica in Portland. "I saw the news online," Jessica said without preamble. "There was an article about military families being recognized, and your name was mentioned. What's going on?" Sarah explained the week's revelations, their father's decorations, the trust fund, the job offers, and the military's interest in recruiting her. Jessica listened without interruption until Sarah finished. "So what are you going to do?" Jessica asked. "I think I'm going to follow Dad's example," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not the leaving part, but the service part. I think I'm going to accept the military commission." "Really? That's a huge change from accounting." "It's not really a change," Sarah realized as she spoke. "It's a continuation. Dad served in intelligence, protecting people he'd never meet. I can do the same thing, but with better communication with my family." After hanging up with Jessica, Sarah made her final decision. She would call Colonel Williams in the morning and accept the intelligence position. She would give Crawford Industries 2 weeks' notice, thanking them for the opportunities but explaining that she'd found her true calling. And she would trade her second-hand blazers for a military uniform, carrying forward the legacy of service that had defined her family for longer than she'd realized. The next morning, Sarah made one last bicycle ride to Crawford Industries. The squeaky chain and wobbling handlebars that had embarrassed her for weeks now felt like symbols of resilience and resourcefulness rather than poverty and shame. This bicycle had carried her through the most difficult period of her life, and now it would carry her to the threshold of a completely new chapter. As she locked the bike to the rack for the final time, Robert Chen from Facilities Management, appeared beside her. "Heard you might be leaving us," he said. "News travels fast around here." "Small office. But I wanted to tell you something before you go." He paused, looking at the old Schwinn with an expression of respect. "That bicycle of yours reminded me of something important. Sometimes the most valuable things don't look impressive from the outside. It takes wisdom to recognize quality that isn't flashy." Sarah smiled, understanding that his comment applied to more than just transportation. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. That means more than you know. Your father would be proud," he added quietly, "of who you've become and of who you're choosing to become." As Sarah walked through the Crawford Industries lobby for the last time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a struggling woman with an embarrassing bicycle, invisible to coworkers and uncertain about her future. Today, she was the daughter of a decorated war hero, preparing to serve her country in ways she'd never imagined possible. The mockery and shame that had defined her morning commutes had transformed into respect and opportunity. But more importantly, the resentment and confusion about her family's past had resolved into understanding and purpose. That afternoon, Sarah called Colonel Williams to accept the intelligence commission. She gave her notice to Mrs. Patterson, who received the news, with gracious disappointment, and she began planning for a future that honored both her father's legacy and her own journey toward discovering what it meant to serve something greater than herself. The bicycle would go to a local charity where it could help someone else navigate difficult times with dignity and determination. Sarah Martinez would report to officer orientation in 3 weeks, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had started with mockery and led to meaning, from isolation to purpose, from shame to honor. Her father's sacrifice had finally been recognized, and her own service was just beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.